Bread. More than just another kind of food in the Middle Ages, it was life itself. At the break of dawn in any random medieval town, you could already catch the glow of a baker's oven and the aroma of fresh loaves wafting through the streets. Medieval people depended on their daily bread in the most literal sense. It formed the bulk of daily meals, and even language reflected this. The word lord comes from an Old English term meaning loaf guardian, and lady from loaf kneader. Just a few reminders of how fundamental bread was to the lives of medieval people. Furthermore, in the 13th century, there was a French poem, L'Idée de Boulanger. The anonymous author declares that bakers, quote, support the world, statement that once again speaks to the indispensable role that these bakers played. And indeed, from the humblest peasant all the way up to the mightiest noble, everyone relied on the work of bakers. Yet the life of a medieval baker was anything but simple. It was a life of long hours, strenuous labor, and one that was governed by strict regulations, fraught with both risk and reward. And so today, we are going to look at the world of medieval bakers across Europe, from their daily routines, the guilds and regulations that shaped the trade, the social importance of their craft, and of course, the challenges that they faced. Fortunately, we have plenty of contemporary medieval sources and a bit of modern research and recent archaeology to illuminate the topic, the good, the bad, and the truly fascinating. Of course, I'll be doing my best to add in as many little bread and baking puns as I can along the way for you. It's the yeast I can do. Well, let me welcome you to the channel first. Welcome. Anybody new here, it's good to meet you. And if you've not clicked that subscribe button yet, how about you do it? And then, fingers crossed, your feed will be filled with a little bit more educational stuff. Who knows what you'll learn. Now, this video is completely uninterrupted. You won't get any mid-roll ads. We make our bread from the kind donations of those on Super Thanks and the PayPal donation link, and also the Patreon, the YouTube memberships, and the merch store. So, you won't get any ads because of those kind contributions. If you would like to become a member of that prestigious group, just follow the links in the video description, pinned comment, or channel description. You'll find where you need to go if you want to go there. But let's all get relaxed, and we can begin. So, as we probably already know, throughout medieval Europe, bread was the staple food. And that's not just for the poor, but for the rich as well. There was even a common saying of the time that described bread as the staff of life. Perhaps it's a bit of an exaggeration, or perhaps it isn't. You see, in many regions, adults consumed remarkable quantities of bread daily. Let's look at 14th century France, for example. An average person might eat around 1 kilogram of bread a day, so that's around 2 pounds. Now that's a heavy reliance, for sure, and that meant, this reliance, that the quality and type of bread one ate became matters of social distinction and survival. Of course, peasants and nobles alike were certainly both eating bread, but bread is kind of a umbrella term, isn't it? Even when we think of bread in our modern sense, we've kind of went full circle a little bit with it. Bread from the bakery, of course, is vastly superior to bread from the supermarket. And of course, you can probably go and get those cheap loaves of chemical-laden, bleach-drenched bread from the supermarket, or Walmart, Tesco, whatever it is, wherever, Woolworths, wherever you shop. And you might only pay $2, something like that. But if you go to an actual bakery, you can get the quality stuff. Now, you're going to pay more for it, sure. But once you have it once, you'll never go back. It's like going to the butcher. You get the actual good meat. You'll never go to the supermarket again. In any case, in medieval times, the simplest fare was the dense and dark loaf of the peasantry, made from those coarse grains. So think about a multi-grain bread in our modern vernacular. Now, peasants in England, for instance, often ate rye or barley bread, which had a brownish color and a heavy, filling texture. Something you'd have with a nice soup or a pottage, something like that. Now, in parts of France, the common loaf was messlin bread, or maslin in England, a mixture of wheat and rye flours that combined a bit of the prized wheat with the cheaper and hardier rye to pad it out a little bit, make it last. Now, these mixed grain breads were filling and had the advantage of a longer shelf life than pure wheat bread. But they were also coarser and harder to chew, hence you would have it with a soup or some oatmeal, something like that. Just makes it easier to go down. Or you just have a bit of beer with it, the medieval drink of choice. Ale, mead, perhaps. Well, by contrast, the wealthy enjoyed fine white bread made from refined wheat flour, which quite ironic because the white bread nowadays is seen as the cheaper loaf, but the multi-grain, quote, artisan bread is seen as the, well, it's a little bit more expensive, a little bit of a nicer bread, a bit of a reversal from medieval times to modern. Well, nobles in the well-to-do in England dined on soft white loaves known as manchets, or pain demi-monde, pain being the French word for bread, by the way. It was later called pain de monde. Well, these were often made from the flour sifted to remove all of the bran. The slightly lower grade white bread, often called westel, was made from good wheat flour that was not quite thoroughly sifted. This might be eaten by prosperous town folks and merchants. Meanwhile, the poorest folks sometimes had to make do with what was called horse bread, which, well, was quite aptly named. It was composed of whatever grains or legumes were available: rye, oats, pea or bean flour, or even acorns or chestnuts. You better cut them up a bit small, they're a little bit hard to chew. Of course, a loaf like that was dense, dark, and only lightly leavened, and it meant more to stave off hunger than to be enjoyed. Hard times, I suppose. But bread not only filled stomachs, you see, it also carried a symbolic weight in medieval culture. Sharing bread was an emblem of fellowship, and actually the very word companion derives from the Latin cum panis, meaning with bread, and indicates somebody with whom you break bread with. Of course, the modern French pain, panis, coming from that too. Now, the importance of bread is further evident in how it delineated social status at the table. Think about that phrase, upper crust. It's still used today to denote the elite, and has its roots in a medieval dining practice of literally cutting off the upper part of the loaf, and that is the finest and least burnt portion, to serve lords and distinguished guests. In great households, the lord of the manor would be served with the soft top of a well-baked loaf, while the blackened bottom crust, inevitably sooty from the wood-fired oven floor, might be given to servants or the poor. In fact, bread was so central to meals that it often doubled as dishware. Thick slices of stale bread called trenchers were used as plates for serving food. It's kind of like, I don't know in your country if you have cob loaves, but in Australia we have that. And sometimes they'll hollow out some bread, they'll put some stuff in it. Some of the best Eastern European food is just meat stuffed into bread. You really cannot go wrong with that, can't you? Well, after absorbing the meat juices and sauces during the meal, these trencher slices were usually given to beggars, or perhaps to feed dogs, so they wouldn't actually eat that stale bread. It was just, well, used as a serving apparatus. In any case, it was another efficient way to ensure that nothing edible went to waste. When they say edible, of course, they mean edible to beggars and dogs, not to the normal working man. The ubiquity of bread in the medieval diet did come with its own perils, however. You see, a bad grain harvest, that could spell nothing short of catastrophe, and dependence on certain grains could literally poison people. Rye bread, a mainstay for many peasant communities, carried the risk of developing ergot, a fungus that flourished in damp conditions and turned rye kernels dark and toxic. These unfortunate enough to eat ergot-infected bread fell victim to ergotism, known in medieval times as St. Anthony's fire, for the burning sensations and convulsions it caused. Outbreaks of this affliction could kill or maim thousands. Chroniclers in Germany recorded ghastly scenes of sufferers' limbs turning black and even falling off due to gangrene. Such was the fear of corrupted bread that an order of monks, the Antonines, dedicated themselves to caring for ergotism victims, and the disease itself came to be called after their patron saint. Even when the grain was sound, the hunger of hard times forced people to get creative, or perhaps desperate, with bread ingredients. There are accounts of famine time loaves being bulked out with sawdust, moss, or chalk. This was not standard practice by any means, but it does show lengths to which people might go to stretch the flour when food was scarce. Well, bread quite literally meant life or death, and so it was little surprise that the craft of the baker was held both in esteem and under close scrutiny by medieval society. So given the fundamental importance of bread, the trade of the baker was a tightly regulated and organized profession in medieval Europe. In towns and cities, bakers typically operated within the framework of guilds, formal associations that oversaw the training, standards, and business practices of their members. You see, a person could not just set up shop as a baker on a whim. You usually had to progress through a prescribed path, from apprentice to journeyman, and finally, master baker. Well, as an apprentice, a youth, usually a boy in his early teens, would be indentured to an experienced master to learn the craft. After years of learning and hard work, the youth would gain the fundamentals of the trade, and only after a long apprenticeship would the candidate become a journeyman baker. Now, a journeyman basically meant that he was free to earn wages and practice the craft, and journeymen often traveled to gain experience in different bakeries, spreading techniques, and sometimes jealously guarding the recipes of their masters. Finally, the most ambitious or talented could attempt to become a master baker, gaining the right to open his own bakery shop after presenting proof of his skill and, of course, paying the requisite fees to the guild. But the rigors of this journey ensured that those calling themselves masters were well versed in the art and science that was bread making. So bakers' guilds, They emerged as early as the High Middle Ages in many cities. London had an organization of bakers by the 12th century. Records show a fraternity of bakers existed there by 1155. In Paris, the Corporation of Bakers, also known by the old term telemaliers, was among the city's oldest and most prominent guilds. The royal provost of Paris, Etienne Boileau, compiled the Livre des Métiers in 1268 at the behest of King Louis IX, which was a comprehensive list of the rules for trades in Paris. And tellingly, it begins with the Statute of the Bakers. Well, this code, running to 61 articles in total, laid out everything from who could enter the trade and how, stressing the proper apprenticeship and honest conduct, to the quality of ingredients, and even the days on which baking was permitted. We learn from these statutes that baking was not a free-for-all business, but a closely supervised public service. For example, Parisian bakers were forbidden to bake on certain holy days and festivals, a reflection of both religious observance and an attempt to prevent unfair competition. Only if dough was already in the oven when a church holiday vigil began could they finish that bake. Otherwise, their ovens had to go cold in deference to the sacred calendar. Guild membership also conferred benefits and protections. As a collective voice, the guild could petition local authorities for favorable treatment or subsidies when hard times hit. Guilds often acted to protect their members, ensuring that no baker would be ruined by arbitrary taxes or predatory nobles, and there were plenty of them. Bakers in some regions banded together to resist onerous fees imposed by feudal lords for the use of mills or ovens, those little creeping taxes that come up. Clear laws and guild oversight helped avoid arbitrary punishment and also fend off competition from unlicensed sellers. The guilds maintained quality control as well. That was another important part. They inspected members' bread, ensured weights were honest, and fined those who cut the corners. You get it? Cut the corners of the bread, Anyway, this self-policing was in the guild's interest, since one deceitful baker's scandal could tarnish the reputation of all. The guild structure also created a tight-knit professional community, too. Members met on regular occasions and participated in religious observances together. Most guilds had patron saints and held an annual feast day. The patron saint of bakers, of course, varied by region. In Paris, for example, bakers initially venerated Saint Lazare, perhaps seeking protection from leprosy due to their constant exposure to heat. But later they adopted Saint Honoré as their chief patron, a 6th century French bishop who, according to legend, had been a baker before he entered the clergy. In many parts of Germany and Alsace, similarly, bakers placed themselves under the care of St. Nicholas, and often used the pretzel, a traditional bread with religious origins, as a symbol on their signs and seals. These religious ties were not merely symbolic, though. They fostered solidarity and spiritual comfort in a very demanding occupation. When a baker fell ill or a family member died, the guild would rally and provide aid, for example, delivering bread to the family or perhaps even covering funeral costs. All these elements, the years of training, the examinations and fees, the shared saints and standards, it gave the guild baker a distinct identity and pride. Bakers were keenly aware that their craft was extremely important. The poet of the Die de Boulanger might have been poetic in claiming bakers support the world, but it rang true in an age where bread comprised the bulk of most people's meals. If you don't eat, you're dead. With this importance, of course, came heavy expectations, lots of pressure, and the Bakers' Guilds knew that the eyes of both the authorities and the public were always upon them. So what about the daily routine, though? What was it actually like? The normal work of a baker? But long before sunrise, the master and his household, which could include apprentices, journeymen, and perhaps other family members, were already hard at work by flickering candlelight and the red glow of the oven's fire. Not bad for a winter job, I suppose. Baking was largely a pre-dawn activity, so that fresh bread could be ready for the markets and customers in the morning. First order of business each night was to prepare the oven. Medieval ovens were typically large, domed constructions made of stone or brick. Think about a wood-fire pizza oven, that kind of thing. But because ovens got extremely hot and posed a serious fire hazard, they were often built as separate structures, sometimes even at the edge of town or outside city walls to mitigate risk. The baker's team would kindle a fire inside the oven and heat it until the masonry was scorching hot, then sweep out the coals and embers with a long-handled broom. Once the oven's interior was adequately heated, the remaining ash was removed. There was no thermometer or thermostat, of course. You just had to judge that heat by experience. The baker would do this by occasionally tossing a bit of flour inside to see if it scorched instantly. While the oven was being fired, other members of the bakery team were busy grinding grain and mixing dough. Flour was the baker's primary ingredient, and obtaining good flour was an ongoing concern. Many bakers purchased their flour ready ground from millers, who were themselves crucial figures in the food supply chain, by the way. Large towns had water mills or windmills that could produce flour in quantity, but in some cases bakers still did a bit of milling or sifting on site. They used hand-driven cairn stones for small batches and passed flour through cloth or hair sieves to achieve a finer purity. The introduction of hair sieves around the 11th century allowed for much finer white flour than previously possible, enabling bakers to create multiple grades of bread for different customers with different needs and resources. So with the flour ready, the baker mixed it with some water and some form of leavening to make dough. Yeast in the medieval bakery was not a packaged commodity, but rather a byproduct of fermentation. A common source was brewer's yeast, a frothy balm from ale brewing, which bakers would collect and add to the dough. Many bakers also maintained a sourdough starter, a bit of old fermented dough kept alive from batch to batch, which naturally leavened the new dough. As for managing yeast, well, that was a delicate art too. Too little and the bread would be dense, too much and the dough might over-ferment and collapse. So it was a gentle balance, and the baker had to time everything just right, coordinating the rising of the dough with the heating of the oven. Kneading the dough was one of the most labor-intensive parts of the process. Contemporary illustrations and accounts often show bakers stripped down to their shirts, sweating over huge wooden kneading troughs. In a busy bakehouse, the dough quantities were enormous, enough to yield dozens upon dozens of loaves, and all it was worked by hand, occasionally by foot or elbow. You wouldn't want to be eating the dough kneaded by someone's dirty old feet, wouldn't you? Well, it could take 15 minutes or more of vigorous heaving and folding to develop the gluten and eventually distribute the yeast. Apprentices and journeymen provided much of this brute labor, developing the baker's muscles needed for the trade. And you could only imagine the forearms that they would get. Very strong. They're not 4 arms, they're 5 arms. Of course, flour dust hung thick in the air, coating the work surfaces and often the bakers themselves in a fine white powder. Well, once the dough was of the right consistency and had risen sufficiently, it was shaped into loaves. Medieval loaves could be round, oblong, or sometimes even ring-shaped, but the typical loaf was a simple round. In French, a standard round loaf was called a miche. The term boulanger for baker actually comes from boule, meaning ball or round loaf. The more you know. Well, bakers made loaves of various sizes, of course, often standardized by weight. For example, in England, the Assize of bread defined how much a farthing loaf, that is, a loaf sold for a quarter penny, should weigh when wheat cost a certain amount. To identify their products, bakers would sometimes mark their loaves, scoring a pattern or stamping an emblem onto the dough, so that if an inspector found an underweight loaf, the offending bakery could be recognized by its mark. Pretty clever. Well, in general, bakers took care to produce a uniform, quality product, both out of pride and also to avoid trouble with the authorities, or the guild, rather. Well, when the oven was ready, and the dough had sufficiently risen, the baker skillfully loaded the loaves into the oven, using a long-handled wooden paddle called a peel. This tool was quite similar to those used by pizza makers today. It allowed bakers to reach deep inside the hot oven and place loaves on the hearth, that is the oven floor, without burning themselves. Of course, burning yourself, that was, well, you were pretty much just going to burn yourself at some point or another. Well, it took strength and dexterity to load an oven quickly and efficiently. Dozens of loaves might need to go in for a single bake, and once they were all in, the oven door was closed to retain the heat. There was no precise timing by the clock. Instead, bakers relied on experience and cues like the changing aroma of the bread or the color of a test loaf. After sufficient time, the loaves were drawn out one by one with the peel. Because the oven floor could never be perfectly clean of ash and soot, most loaves emerged with a blackened bottom crust. And the customers expected that. It was just the way it was. In manor houses, the servants routinely slipped off the bottom of each loaf, reserving the upper crust for the Lord's table as noted earlier. Well, after baking, the day's bread was sold, and many bakers ran a small shop just outside where they were doing their work, where customers came each morning to get a little bit of breakfast. Others sold at stalls in the marketplaces, and some sent hawkers through the streets to peddle the bread. Large orders for monasteries or noble households might be delivered by cart. Any unsold loaves were, by the day's end, given to the poor, ground into breadcrumbs for cooking or dried into rusks to keep longer. And then the baker cleaned up and ready to start the cycle again the next night. Well, because bread was such a critical commodity, medieval authorities paid extraordinary attention to how it was made and also how it was sold. The most famous regulations were the English Assize of bread and ale, first promulgated in the 13th century under Henry III. This law was actually one of the earliest pieces of consumer protection legislation in Europe. It regulated the price, the weight, and the quality of bread, as well as ale, of course. This was all to ensure fairness and to prevent profiteering. Well, in effect, the Assize fixed how much bread one should get per penny paid, adjusting the required loaf weight as the grain prices rose or fell. If grain became expensive, the baker was allowed to sell smaller loaves at the same price, so that he could recoup his costs. And if grain became cheaper, the loaves were expected to be larger. In theory, this protected consumers from overpricing. and also ensure that even in lean times, the poor could at least get a little bit of bread. Well, the Assize of bread was rigorously enforced in England for centuries, and remarkably, it remained on the law books until the 19th century. While other parts of medieval Europe had similar ordinances, many towns on the continent knew that riots could break out over bread if prices skyrocketed or loaves were too small. City councils and princes, therefore, set rules to preempt public unrest. For example, some local laws in Italy and Germany specified standard weights for loaves and fixed maximum prices during shortages. In France, royal edicts and town charters likewise established oversight of bakers. Paris had officials known as boulangers, that is, sworn baker inspectors, tasked with checking bread in the markets and certifying fair weight. Enforcement of bread laws was taken very seriously. Periodically, local authorities, sometimes the mayor, sometimes market inspectors, or even knights appointed as bread wardens, would visit bakeries or examine bread for sale. They would weigh loaves to ensure they matched the legal standard, and we've actually got records of such inspections going on in London, where city officers seized underweight loaves and identified the baker by the stamp on the bread. If a baker was found guilty of giving deficient weight or otherwise violating the Assize, punishments followed an escalating scale. Well, for the first offense, you'd probably just get away with a fine. The baker would be immersed, that is, penalized a sum of money proportional to the offense. A second offense could bring a heavier fine and a stern warning. But if a baker was a repeat offender or committed a serious fraud, he would be put into the oven and turned into bread himself. No, I'm joking. But in any case, the consequences became public and very humiliating. English law, for example, prescribed the pillory for persistent, dishonest bakers, and the pillory was basically a wooden framework set up in a public square with holes for the offender's head and hands. You know the one I'm talking about. A convicted baker would be locked in the pillory, exposed for hours to the jeers and occasional throwing of rotten vegetables of the townspeople. But this public shaming was intended as a deterrent and a way to restore trust by making an example of dishonest people. There are colorful accounts of pilloried bakers too. One chronicle recounts a baker who was dragged through the streets with a weight-deficient loaf hung around his neck as a sign of his crime, before being clamped in the pillory. Women bakers, too, could face such punishment. A 1310 record tells of female bakers from outside London who were arrested for sending underweight bread into the city and were duly pilloried for it. In some cases, instead of the pillory, the baker might be paraded on a hurdle or thrown into a tumbril, which is a kind of cart or stool kind of thing. Well, again, to be pelted by the angry customers. And for the truly poor businessman, the one that just cannot stop, authorities could strip a baker of their profession entirely, banishing him from the guild and forbidding him to bake bread for public sale henceforth. Your bread-making days are over. Well, given that baking was one's life trade, this of course was a devastating punishment. These strict measures show how trust was the cornerstone of the baker's relationship with the public. A medieval housewife needed confidence that the loaf she bought for her family was honest in weight and wholesome in quantity. Well, any hint that bakers might cheat could erode social stability, hence the keen interests of city elders and kings in bread regulation. Rulers sometimes issued special edicts against specific abuses. King Edward I of England, for example, in the late 13th century, forbid bakers from using ground bone or chalk to whiten bread flour. Well, the penalty for using such deceptive additives was, quite fittingly, an hour in the public pillory. You better hope that word does not spread quickly. But of course, human nature is what it is, isn't it? Some bakers tried to outsmart the system. Everyone's trying to get something for nothing, aren't they? Medieval records and later commentary give us a sense of the tricks of a bad baker. Some mixed cheaper flours like bean or pea flour into wheat and failed to disclose it, conveniently. Or they used spoiled grain and excess bran in breads meant for the poor. But more deviously, a few scoundrel bakers even attempted to hide unlawful substances in their loaves. There are reports of bread padded with chalk or loaded with a lump of metal to increase its weight, which I assume you would find that out when you bit down on it, right? I mean, pretty obvious. In any case, such extreme frauds were certainly not the norm. They were the medieval equivalent of horror stories. But when they did happen, they were harshly punished when uncovered. In fact, the need to stay on the safe side of the law might have given rise to the tradition of the baker's dozen. Now, a normal dozen is 12, but a baker's dozen means 13. According to tradition, English bakers, wary of being fined or flogged for selling short weight, developed the practice of adding a free extra loaf for every dozen. By giving 13 loaves when a customer ordered 12, the baker provided a safety margin to ensure the total weight was at least what it should be. This practice, recorded since the 13th century, served as a kind of insurance policy for the baker. A small loss in profit to avoid the far greater cost of a brush with the law. Well, despite all these regulations, or indeed probably because of them, many bakers took their responsibilities seriously and cultivated reputations for honesty. Guild records show that upright bakers often supported the enforcement of standards, since it kept rogues from undercutting them. And authorities, for their part, recognized that bakers provided an essential service and needed fair treatment. So during extreme situations like famines, this relationship could become quite strained. Rulers might temporarily suspend the usual rules, ordering bakers to sell bread cheaply or distribute stocks to the hungry even at a personal loss. Guilds sometimes negotiated subsidies or grain allotments in such cases to keep their members from going bankrupt. In the late 14th century, for instance, the city of Florence, during a shortage, fixed bread prices so low that bakers could barely afford to do their job. The Bakers' Guild petitioned for access to cheaper government grain to continue their work. The legal framework around bread was thus a delicate balancing act, ensuring affordable bread and preventing fraud while also keeping bakers in business. The elaborate rules and the longevity of the Assize of bread attest that bread was far too important to be left to the whims of the market. It was, in effect, treated as a public utility, with the medieval baker at the center of a centuries-long early experiment in consumer protection. Well, let's look at the social hierarchy of medieval towns. And within that hierarchy, bakers occupied an interesting middle ground. You see, there were skilled tradespeople, and as members of a guild, they ranked among the middling sort. They weren't nobles or high clergy, that's for sure, but they were respectable craftsmen, integral to daily life. A successful master baker could be reasonably well-to-do. Because bread was in constant demand, a busy baker might turn a good profit, enabling the baker to own a comfortable house or contribute to civic projects. And some bakers even served in town councils or took on municipal roles like market supervision, indicating a level of esteem and trust placed in them. However, bakers also face suspicions and stereotypes. Much like millers who are infamous for cheating their customers on weight, bakers had to contend with certain weariness from the public. Common folk might swap stories about the baker who mixed chalk into his flour, or one who sold loaves that were half air. This meant trust had to be earned daily. Bakers did so by establishing a reputation for fairness and consistency. For example, a conscientious baker might always give a little extra, hence the baker's dozen, or make sure his weights were visible to customers. Small gestures that reassured the public. Guild regulations often encourage such behavior. On the feast of their patron saint, bakers' guilds would sometimes distribute extra loaves to the poor as a form of charity and public relations. And not only was this an act of Christian duty, but it also demonstrated the guild's commitment to feeding the community, thereby fostering a bit of goodwill. Now, in times of famine or grain shortage, bakers were often on the front line of public anger. Hungry crowds could easily suspect bakers of hoarding grain or profiteering, making them scapegoats when bread grew scarce. Chronicles recount that in severe crises, authorities sometimes had to protect bakers from mob violence, or compel them to bake at controlled prices to feed the populace. In 1527, during a famine in Lyon, a little bit after the medieval period, but we'll include it, rioters targeted bakers' shops, prompting the city to enforce emergency just price measures. Such incidents were a constant worry for bakers and rulers in earlier centuries as well. You see, they show how politically volatile the food supply could be, and how bakers often bore the brunt of popular frustration when food ran short. But within their own community of the Guildham family, bakers navigated challenges of a different kind. Baking was often a family enterprise. The master's wife and children commonly worked alongside him. In fact, many guilds explicitly allowed a baker's widow to continue operating the bakery if her husband died, at least until she remarried or her children grew old enough to take over, recognizing that she likely knew the business intimately. And indeed, women were deeply involved in baking. A baker's wife often worked in the shop or at the kneading trough, and widows of bakers frequently kept the business running, sometimes being officially licensed by the guild to do so. Illuminated manuscripts from the later Middle Ages even show women working together at the oven and at the dough table, indicating that all female bakeries' workspaces, though not the norm, certainly did exist. While formal guild membership was usually closed to women except through a husband, in practice many bakeries were family operations that relied on labor and management of wives and daughters. In London, for example, women known as brewsters or bakesters, the feminine forms of brewers and bakers, were common in the early medieval period before guild structures strictly became male. Even in later periods, the term bakester survived in English as a surname, Baxter, hinting at the legacy of women bakers. Now, women in a bakery, working in a bakery rather, was physically demanding for anyone, and especially for women in an age where heavy labor was often presumed to be men's work. Yet the historical evidence shows that women did do their share. In some cases, all women teams might run a bakery, particularly in towns where a widow took on apprentices or where sisters inherited a bakery. In Montpellier, France, in the 14th century, Records note a widow who successfully petitioned to continue her late husband's baking business, and another case in which a mother and daughter team managed a village bakery. Now, these examples show that while the public image of the baker was typically male, the reality often involved a husband and wife partnership, or a similar family collaboration. In any case, it was all hands on deck in this enterprise. But bakers were also intimately connected to millers and the broader feudal economy of food. In the countryside, feudal obligations often meant that bakers, or peasants baking themselves, had to use the lord's mill and the lord's oven, both for a fee, of course, due to manorial monopolies. This system, common in medieval times, especially early medieval times with the banal mill and oven, essentially forced a rural people to rely on the lord's baker or oven keeper. By contrast, independent town bakers valued the freedom to grind again and bake in their own facilities without such interference. The rise of guild-regulated baking in free towns can be seen as a part of a larger movement away from feudal controls and toward a market-based urban economy. But what about the baker's personal status within the community? Well, bakers generally enjoyed a reputation as honest, pious folk, or at least they had to in order to keep their customers and avoid scrutiny. Their very schedules set them apart. While others were sleeping, bakers labored by night and were among the first up in the morning, a fact often noted with appreciation by their neighbors. At the same time, a lazy or dishonest baker could very quickly find themselves become a pariah. City records occasionally mention bakers who were boycotted or even driven out of business by collective anger after repeated cheating or a scandal, such as selling bread made from bad flour, getting everybody sick, that kind of thing. But on the whole, though, as long as a baker met the community's expectations, providing fair weight, decent quality, and maybe a little bit of charity, throwing those scraps to the poor, he and his household would be counted perhaps among the most respectable of the common citizenry. Certainly something that the community needs. And so, from the pre-dawn kindling of the oven fire to the careful sale of the day's loaves, the life of a medieval baker was a cycle of labor and service woven tightly into the fabric of their communities. We've seen that bread was certainly the cornerstone of medieval existence, and by extension, bakers were the craftsmen at that cornerstone, sustaining society day by day with their work. The rewards of a baker's life included a steady livelihood and the simple pride of nourishing the community. The hardships, well, they ranged from grueling hours at the oven so hot to the ever-present fear of penalties for any misstep. Whether it was on purpose or not, the result is the same, and so is the punishment. Of course, the whole craft was filled with these intriguing customs and quirks, from the invocation of patron saints to the giving of a baker's dozen to ensure fairness. Behind every loaf of bread was the toil of a baker who often labored through the night so that others could break their fast each morning. And think about it. If you're listening to this at perhaps 3 a.m. in the morning, perhaps some baker in our modern era is getting himself ready, or herself ready, to go off to the bakery and begin their work. So imagine once more a medieval baker shutting his shop up at noon after selling out the day's bread. His arms are sore and tired from all that kneading, and the eyes are hurting from the smoke. But perhaps there's a certain satisfaction in that work. The village or town will eat today, in parts because of his great efforts the night before. In the grand scheme of kings and popes, a baker might seem like a minor character, just a simple craftsman. But to the people lining up for his loaves each dawn, he was nothing less than a lifeline. Everything is connected. Everybody's role is important. Sometimes people don't get written into the history books, but that's what videos like this are for. And it is fitting that in the Lord's Prayer one implores, "Give us this day our daily bread." For in medieval times each day's survival truly depended on those like the baker doing their humble but vital work. And so the life of medieval bakers, with all of its trials and triumphs, ultimately reminds us that even the most ordinary and forgotten of professions can be the very thing that, as we said at the start, supports the world. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a while since I actually made bread. I used to make it quite a lot. And believe me, the forearms, ugh. Well, it depends on what kind of bread that you're making, but I used to have a bread maker, a little machine, years ago, but it wasn't very good. You need to buy the big one, you know what I mean? The big one. And sometimes you'll make the bread and it'll go off, and if there's too much humidity or something like this, sometimes the game's not worth the candle. But your homework is next time you go and buy bread, go and buy it from the actual bakery. Don't get it from the supermarket. It's just not as good. And you should support those smaller bakeries. Yes, it might be a little bit more expensive, but what price can you put on good food? It might only be an extra 50 cents or €1 or $1, whatever it is for you. In any case, I am going to thank the people who perhaps don't support the world, but support the channel. Let me read out the list. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, and Carrie. All right, thank you very much. And I hope I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for listening. Good night for now. Lots of love to you all. And farewell.